Good evening, everybody. This is Cinnamon Noir. And welcome to Castlevania Circle of the Moon. I know that I said in the Aria of Sorrow Let's Play that I probably wouldn't be doing any more Castlevania games, but I lied, so here we are. This is the first of the GBA Metroidvanias, and a very interesting game that does things kind of bizarrely. For some reason I let the opening title go on to the Attract mode, which is kind of a funny thing this game has, not being an arcade game. But yeah. I mistakenly thought that I would cut off the music if I went to the title select, the file select, but actually it carries on into the file select. This voice you're hearing singing is actually singing the Kyrie eleison, which is the first part of the ordinary Mass in Catholic liturgy, and the only part of the Mass, as far as I can tell, that's in Greek. Kyrie eleison literally means, Lord have mercy, like a blues song. So this game is set in 1830, which is much more of, I'd say, a proper, like, Dracula kind of time period than a lot of the other ones we've seen recently. And unusually it takes place not at Dracula's castle, but in a castle in Austria, where his worshippers are attempting to bring him back. Successfully, as we'll soon see. Otherwise there wouldn't be much of a game. But it is funny how many Castlevania games actually do not take place in Dracula's castle, per se. I think it's at least half of them. Either not taking place in a castle at all, or not taking place in Dracula's specifically. So here we have Camilla, who is basically the leader of Dracula's worshippers. She's based on the character Carmilla from the novel of the same name from the 19th century, one of the earliest vampire works of fiction, actually. And again, so there can be a game, Dracula's not at his full power yet. And he's interrupted by our vampire hunters, 3 of them in this case, including one who sealed him the last time, which was about 50 years ago. So yeah, he's an old man now, and Dracula just completely burns him. And says something that's a little strange, that he's going to use his rival to return to power. Lord knows what he has in mind for Master Morris, but he sends the 2 of us away and falling down this very long pit. Presumably, it'll be hard for us to get back up to where he is, but we'll do our best. So there are 2 main characters in this game, more or less, Nathan and Hugh. Hugh is the son of Master Morris, and Nathan is basically just his star pupil. Kind of more favored, actually, than Hugh is, which is going to end up being a major plot point. So this is our protagonist, Nathan. I actually like him a lot, even though he has like a fairly simple walk cycle and he's kind of a more just standard fighter-type character. There's not a lot of special stuff about him, his personality. I do think he has kind of a stylish way about him. I also like the way he swings his whip. Actually, that little circular swirl that he has is much more useful than the typical dangly, jangly whip thing that most Belmonts have. Also interesting that there are no Belmonts in this story. You have Hugh and Morris Baldwin, who are just sort of related to them. And then Nathan, who doesn't really have any basic connection to the Belmonts at all. But he does have the Hunter Whip, which is like a not-quite vampire killer, which I suppose is somewhat effective against the undead? It's a little hard to say. The plot in this game is a little confusing and is not particularly... it's not told in a particularly detailed way within the game itself. You kind of have to rely on the manual and other things like that. So, Circle of the Moon gets off to a very slow start. I think the reason for this probably, the reason why your mobility is so restricted here, you'll notice Nathan walks very slowly, is to sort of reinforce the point of this game, that it's very deliberate and your positioning within a room is very important. So I think they do not want you rushing around this room quickly, because they want you to, figure out how you're supposed to move and attack. It essentially is a tutorial, even though it's not structured like one. We also get here 2 very interesting cards that are part of the dual setup system in this game. Basically, the magic system. A pretty interesting and actually quite versatile thing that this game has, which is somewhat comparable to Soma's Souls from Aria of Sorrow. But there's a lot fewer combinations, and I also have to say it's a lot harder to get the really powerful ones in this game than it is in Aria of Sorrow. Some of those cards are very rare. These first 2 cards, however, you'll notice there are 2 different sections. On top you have various gods, and then on the bottom you have various, magical creatures. And the combination of the two allows you to do various different types of attacks, stat boosts, and various things like that. But the first ones we get here are the the Mercury card is the first one. Just like how Mercury is the first planet, there is some astrological significance to these cards. And then we also get the Salamander creature card. When you combine Mercury and Salamander, you get to have a Flame Whip, which is pretty useful this early on. Most of the enemies in this first catacomb section are weak against fire. So it's a pretty nice thing to have. I am fairly certain that you are almost guaranteed to get those two cards in this room. They're very common drops in any case, and they come from the two most common enemies in the early game, Skeletons and Boneheads. We also have an Earth Demon down here. There's another card we can get from him, but we can also get a rare piece of gear. There's not a lot of equipment in Circle of the Moon, but there are some useful items that you can get. One thing that is a bit upsetting about Circle of the Moon is that there are no shops anywhere. So you cannot buy potions, you cannot buy better gear, and there's no money. Which honestly makes this game a lot harder, and I would say of the three GBA Metroidvanias, this is the hardest, and possibly the hardest Metroidvania game I've ever played. I've never really played the original Castlevania games that were just linear side-scrollers, but this game to me, much more than Order of Ecclesia actually, very much brings back that sense of playing that kind of game, rather than a Metroidvania. So we pick up our first sub-weapon here. This game does have sub-weapons. It's the knife. Not much good to us, but we'll see it in action a little bit later. More importantly, we've gotten these dash boots, which enable us to actually run back and forth, gives you much more maneuverability. So, the opening of this game is a little bit misleading. It kind of makes you think this game's going to be really slow and tedious. Actually, you get some really useful mobility upgrades fairly early. And yet, at the same time, the game can sometimes have a very slow pace. This game is an interesting structure overall, I would say. It's more like a Metroid game almost than it is like most Castlevania games, because backtracking is very much encouraged. There's actually not much freedom of mobility. While there's kind of a labyrinth quality to the map, there's very few places where you can make progress at any given time, and you're never given like an alternative of different levels you want to go to at one time. You always have to go to each level that's been unlocked by your last mobility upgrade. And so that is a lot more like Metroid. It's not like... Well, I suppose Aria of Sorrow is a bit more like this. But it's certainly not like Symphony of the Night. I don't think a lot of people realize the extent to which Symphony of the Night has a structure that's very different from most of its own sequels, let alone other games that are called Metroidvanias. There's a continuum where on one side you have Symphony of the Night and the other side you have Super Metroid. And games kind of go back and forth between them. One of the things I like about this game, even though it's far from my favorite Metroidvania, is that it is so Metroid-y. And it sort of has this tough quality where you have to figure things out. Exploration is a puzzle, not just a series of alternatives. Another thing I have to say I love about this game, which you've probably been hearing in the background all this time, is the soundtrack. In this first area, this track, which is called Awake, is an amazing piece of music. I like it a lot. And in general, I would say, this game's soundtrack, I think, is actually the best of the GBA Metroidvanias. It's kind of funny to me that people often put down Harmony of Dissonance's soundtrack, which I kind of like, but I can see that, and say that Aria of Sorrows is much better. In my opinion, Harmony's and Aria's soundtracks are kind of equally mediocre, and this is the really quality one. It also kind of has that Kirby quality, where a lot of the tracks in this game are like a greatest hits of the Castlevania series, and the arrangements in this game are really good, so... to a certain extent, I would say that if... the graphics are the main hook of Harmony of Dissonance, and the combat is the main hook of Aria of Sorrow. The music is kind of the main hook for me in this game. We'll be seeing some more banger tracks in a little bit. But for now, we're just going through here with the skeleton spears. These are pretty easy enemies. You can take them out in one hit. One interesting thing about this game is it's kind of hyper-lethal, like Spelunky rather than something like Aria of Sorrow. Enemies early on do a lot of damage, or at least some of them do, but you also do a lot of damage to them. And things quickly ramp up, so that there's always this kind of tension between how strong you are and how strong the enemies are. The game is always introducing new enemies who just hit like a truck. And so you never really can relax in this game, except when you're backtracking through an area that you already know really well. Another thing this game does, which we'll see in later episodes, is it actually does replace enemies with harder ones at some point, to keep you on your toes, which I think is pretty clever. I always liked when Resident Evil did that. Another thing I should probably say at this point. Oh, well, maybe first I should talk about the upgrades that we're seeing here, for people who aren't familiar with this game. So we just got an HP max and a heart max. These are pretty self-explanatory. The heart maxes increase the number of hearts you can have, which lets you use more sub-weapons. The HP ups and MP ups just increase those bars. HP ups, I would say, are the most important in this game. For most of the spells you're able to use with the DSS system, you don't use up much magic when using them, and so magic ups are not that important. However, once you get a combination you really like, you might find yourself using it so much that you use it up, and so at that point having more magic is pretty useful. Another reason I don't worry much or sweat much about losing magic is that magic restoring pickups are actually one of the most common in this game. They're more common than health restores, which is very strange. We also get to see here the knife in action. In Castlevania tradition, the knife freaking sucks. It's terrible. The only real benefit that it has is that it's cheap in terms of hard cost. I think each knife costs just 1. But we're going to find much better sub-weapons in this game. In fact, the sub-weapons in this game, in my opinion, are pretty unbalanced, especially since there are a lot of hard-ups. There's really not much benefit to having a cheap sub-weapon. Instead, you want the stronger ones that are more expensive. So here we have another HP max. You might have noticed that we were only able to find these various rooms with the upgrades in them because we slid through that one area. This is something that I think might confuse people on starting this game, because in a lot of Metroidvania games, sliding is a power-up. You know, in Portrait of Ruin, for instance, you get the lizard tail, so you can slide. But in this game, sliding is just something basic that Nathan can do. It's kind of like Mega Man, where you can do that. But yeah, you have to use it in this case in order to get through that little side area. And as I mentioned in my comparison of the scariness of various Castlevania games, I don't really think of these upgrades as being that optional. They are technically optional, but if you don't get them, things get really difficult for you. Oh, you might also notice here our little friend the mouse cursor. That was an artifact of my recording software. I normally remember to unclick the little thing that says record the mouse cursor. In this case, I forgot. So we will be seeing him pop up from time to time. Hopefully it's not too distracting, because it's not there for very long. Even when I thought I wasn't recording it, I don't like to keep my cursor there, because obviously it gets in the way of me seeing stuff. But it's a kind of interesting thing, actually, with the sub-weapons in this game. So, like in the linear Castlevania games, that this game, I would say, resembles more so than a lot of the other Metroidvanias. Not all of the power-ups are actually power-ups. If you have a good sub-weapon and you run into the knife and lose your old one, which we'll see in some later areas, depending on the room, it might be hard to pick up your old sub-weapon. That can actually be a serious downgrade, and it can really be upsetting when you do that. I think there are people who don't necessarily believe that that's deliberate, but I definitely believe that it is. Konami is the same company that made Gradius, which is well known for being a game where you get these power-ups, and then later on you'll run into power-ups that will replace the good ones, and if you run into them, you're just SOL. Like, that's your fault. You need to make sure to avoid bad power-ups in addition to getting good ones. It feels to me like a very different design sensibility from something like Mario, where for the most part, the worst an upgrade can be is, like, useless. It never hurts you to pick up an upgrade in Mario. Except in the Lost Levels with the poison mushrooms, but that was recognized as a pretty different kind of Mario game. So this first section is generally pretty easy. One thing, however, you do see here that shows kind of how challenging and punishing this game can be is that even when you get hit for tiny amounts of damage, Nathan's knockback is pretty insane. He will fly across the room from getting a scratch on him, which in terms of maintaining your positioning can actually make things really difficult. In this game, where you are in the room matters a lot in terms of how well you can deal out damage and, more importantly, avoid damage from the bosses. The bosses have some crazy attacks, and you need to be able to position yourself correctly to avoid them. We can also see here, by the way, how useful that swinging ability of the whip is. That will save your bacon quite a bit. If you play this game, you will have to use that. You basically just do it by holding down the attack button, similar to how the dangle jangle worked in previous Castlevania games. And subsequent Castlevania games, actually, now that I come to think of it. Harmony of Dissonance has that. It is kind of funny to me how I enjoy replaying Harmony of Dissonance more than this, but a lot of that is just because Harmony of Dissonance is easier. This game has its own kind of charms, and it is a very strange game. I really do think it captures the feel of an older Castlevania game better than the other Metroidvanias, even Order of Ecclesia, which was intended to do that. Which I just find kind of funny. When earlier I said that this game has graphics comparable to a Game Boy Color game. That was pretty unfair, actually. It has graphics comparable to an early Game Boy Advance game, which is what it is. There are some areas that look quite nice, but I will say in general, the graphics are pretty simple, and more oriented, I'd say, towards setting a mood than looking like a real place. However, in terms of atmosphere, the game actually does a pretty good job. So we do get a rare drop there from a skeleton, a healing potion. Like I said before, there are no shops in this game, so you have to rely on basically grinding to get any items that you want to have, which can be a bit annoying. Not only because they are so rare, like potions are actually an astonishingly rare drop from skeletons. If your luck is normal, and I've already, I think, expanded it by putting on a luck boosting item, but if your luck is normal, you get maybe 1 potion for every 100 skeletons you kill. It really is that rare. It's like finding the Sword of Kings in Earthbound, and this is just a potion. Furthermore, in this game, potions suck. They restore 20 HP each, which, at the start of the game, I think you have about 250 or 300 health points. The fact that a potion only restores 20 is almost insane. Even like this early on in the game, potions can't even make up for a single hit that you get. So really, in this game, healing is very much de-emphasized, and it's more about avoiding damage altogether than about being able to heal it. This is not a game you can win by battle attrition. Speaking of which, here we come to the first boss. If the first area, the catacombs, did not convince you that this is a different kind of Castlevania game and one where you're going to have to be more careful, this boss will definitely do it. Circle of the Moon has almost an insane amount of boss difficulty. Not so much that you can't win against these bosses if you're a novice, but that they'll punish you so much, and they have so many varied attacks that are hard to figure out. So for instance, this is Cerberus. It's a wolf, it's a beast, and yet a lot of its attacks could be described as spells, like it's able to summon those little electrical balls that cover the whole room and sweep back and forth, which is kind of strange. A lot of enemies in this game, I should say, a lot of bosses in this game, have attacks that don't necessarily seem to fit with their appearance, and which are surprisingly hard to dodge. So, in this room, for instance, the structure of this room makes it kind of difficult to fight Cerberus. He's a big boss, he takes up a ton of the room, and his movements are kind of erratic. He can do that sudden pounce forward. There's a tell for that, but it's hard to read. And he also moves so fast. He'll also do this move, which I absolutely hate. It's my most hated move of all of his. Where he'll jump to one side of the room, and then just sweep the entire room with this laser that does massive amount of damage for this early in the game. The other thing is that I think his tell for the leap forward is very similar to a lot of his other tells, so it convinces me to run away from him when I really should be wailing on him with damage. And you can see here, he just moves crazy fast. I mean, it's ludicrous. Not to mention the fact that you can't really jump away from that attack that he does, the laser beam, by going away from him. You have to sort of jump into him and then hope you land on a higher platform. I hope you can kind of see what I'm getting at. This is really hard for a first boss. It doesn't ease you into the idea of fighting bosses at all. In fact, this is just, it's a kind of tough, like, mid-level boss in any other Metroidvania game. What are you waiting around for, Nathan? Oh, I know, you're waiting for that orb to show up that heals your HP and MP. Well, guess what? In this game, there's no orbs. They don't show up. I don't know what made them decide to do this, but this game is so punishing, it doesn't even restore your health and magic after you beat a boss. Which means it is not uncommon in this game for you to, especially if you're a novice, which I still kind of consider myself a novice at this game. I've only played it a couple of times, and I don't even remember if I've beaten it. I've gotten to the end, but I might not have beaten it. When you are a novice at this game, you'll fight these bosses, and you don't have the ability to heal at all, which means you can't make any mistakes. It's not like Dark Souls, where you have healing that's always guaranteed to be with you. In this game, there just is no healing at all. So really, you just have a limited number of mistakes you can make, and that's it. The game will not let you make more than, let's say, a dozen mistakes in that boss fight that will get you hit. If you do more than that, you just die and you have to restart. Another thing about this game is that save points are pretty few and far between. So what I was going to say is, it's not uncommon in this game for you to beat a boss and have just a sliver of health left, and then die to some scrub mook enemy outside the boss room on your way back to a save point, which is pretty much the only time in this game you will get your health healed. The other way, of course, that you can heal all your health is to find an HP upgrade, which actually does come in handy sometimes, and there are some rooms where they kind of cleverly place a bunch of enemies and then an HP upgrade at the end so you can top up your health once you're finished dealing with all of them. However, one nice thing about this game, and something that's one of the saving graces and the reason that I find it fun to play and replay, is that your mobility gets upgraded very quickly in this game. So even though we just defeated the first boss and we've only gotten 2 mobility upgrades, those upgrades have been a dash and a double jump. So we are already actually quite mobile. Nathan already has the ability to cover a pretty wide stretch of territory right off the bat, which is nice. Another pretty nice thing is these mummies we're fighting. A pretty, goofy kind of enemy for this early in the game. One thing I do like about Circle of the Moon is that even though its aesthetics are very grim and sort of down to earth, there are some pretty fun enemies in it. And because you mostly just get a title for them, you're left to wonder, what kind of enemy they are. Anyway, we now make our way to the Abyss Stairway, which is an area with a concept that I like a lot. It's like this endless stair, or at least it's supposed to look that way. We also recently just got the Holy Water, which is one of my favorite power-ups in any... Sorry, I should say, one of my favorite sub-weapons in any Castlevania game. We're going to get a lot of use of the Holy Water. In this game, it is quite useful. You can throw 2 sub-weapons at a time in this game, and the Holy Water will hit an enemy and then fall down on it, and still cause more damage. So it's more useful than it is in, say, Harmony of Dissonance. You'll also notice here that in order to get through to the Abyss Stairway, we have to pass through this early area of the catacombs. This game encourages a lot of backtracking, and the map is somewhat tightly connected. One interesting thing about this game is that there are not many warp rooms. We'll find a warp room pretty soon, but for most of the game you'll only be dealing with 3 warp rooms to cover the entire castle. So really there is just a lot of walking back and forth in this game. Not the most fun thing in the world, but I'm more tolerant of backtracking than I think a lot of other people are, so it doesn't bother me that much. It's also, again, something that makes the game similar to Metroid. Metroid is a game that encourages backtracking, and of course, for a very long time, did not have warp points, just relied on sort of the interconnectedness of the map. Speaking of the map, one interesting thing you might have noticed there is there's a pretty prominent hole in the map, around the area where we fell. When you find areas like that in the game, it is quite common that there will be a secret room, usually containing some kind of power-up. In fact, almost invariably containing a power-up. And often harder enemies. So this axe armor, who we still have trouble dealing with, although with the Holy Water it's easier, he is guarding an MP up. This game... I've never liked that idea that you have to bomb every inch of the floor in Metroid or anything like that, but this game I think actually comes the closest to the concept of you have to test every wall in order to find all the secrets. I don't know if I'd say that's good or bad, it appeals to different people. So like Donkey Kong Country, for instance, is a great example of a game where the secrets are really, hidden, and you have to work like crazy in order to find them. But that's sort of the point, is games are supposed to reward, the interest of the player. So, who can say if that's actually a good or a bad thing? Lots of people love Donkey Kong Country precisely for the reason that it has all those secrets. Anyway, I'll leave you with that thought for now, and I will see you next time on the next episode. Good night, everybody.